Welcome to Gardening in the Mountains, Managing Perennial Stems for Pollinators. I'd like to welcome our speaker today, Dr. Hannah Levenson. Hannah is a research scholar in the Department of Entomology and Plant Pathology at North Carolina State University, where she leads the Specialty Crops Integrative Pest and Pollinator Management Lab. She's a bee expert with extensive experience working with both honeybees and native bees. Dr. Levenson's research focuses on making pest management more sustainable and protecting pollinators, especially in agricultural systems. We'll be recording this program and making it available later on. Welcome, Dr. Levenson. We look forward to your program today.
Thanks, Allison. I'm going to be talking about managing perennial stems for overwintering pollinators. And I want to go ahead and highlight my co-lead for this project, Elsa Youngstead, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Applied Ecology here at NC State. The start of this project was we were getting a lot of feedback from the public that they wanted more information about how they should be managing their gardens, particularly going into the winter, to make sure that we're putting these gardens out to protect pollinators. We want to make sure that we're doing the right thing to help support them over the winter, and then we're not managing the gardens and then immediately removing those pollinators that we tried so hard to help and support throughout the spring and summer. We were getting questions over and over again about this. And initially we did what probably all of you did when you asked those questions. We went to the internet to see what we could find. We found quite a lot of differing opinions. Some things say, wait until the spring. Some things say, wait until the fall, which are very opposite recommendations. Maybe they have recommendations for how they want you to cut back the stems, but they don't say the best time. Or maybe people are giving recommendations based on their personal experience, something they've seen. We couldn't find anything that was data backed. We couldn't find a research project that told us this is the best time because of this. We decided that we needed to understand this better. So we set up an entire project so that we could have data that we felt good giving these recommendations from. This is a very hot topic right now because I would say that there's a pollinator garden boom going on. If you look in this map in the upper corner, this is just one program that is advertising the benefits of putting pollinator habitat back into our landscapes, the Million Pollinator Gardens Project. You can see just how many gardens this one project has registered, and there are dozens of other programs that we could look to for registering gardens and habitats. They well surpassed their goal of hitting 1 million gardens. That means that there is a lot of this habitat, a lot of these gardens in the landscape that eventually do need to be managed. If you look at the bottom left-hand photo, this is what those gardens will look like in the spring and summer. Really showy, really beautiful, lots of activity of insects and other organisms in the gardens. Probably all of the neighbors will be happy at this point in the year because there's a lot of beauty being added. But in time, all of this is going to look like the bottom right-hand photo, where the plants have senesced, they're browned, there's no more flowers, all the birds have eaten the seeds. This may be when people start getting complaints from their neighbors, or maybe you yourself don't like how this looks and you want to get your hands in there and tidy up the garden. At this point, we're wondering, how do we do this the right way? That's what we'll talk about with the project today. Before we get into the project and what we did and the results, I want to do a really quick background on bees so that we know who we're thinking about when managing these pollinator gardens. Bees are a very diverse group of insects, one of the most diverse groups that we have. They come in all shapes, all sizes, colors. They live differently from each other. They behave differently from each other. To give you an idea of this diversity, there's 564 different bee species in North Carolina. There's more than 4,000 different species in North America and more than 20,000 in the world. This makes them really important to us because they play a lot of different roles in the landscape. It makes them really exciting and interesting. I think they're really fun to learn about. It also makes it really hard to know, how do we best protect them? How do we do conservation actions? There's so many differences and nuances within this one group of insects that we call bees. I'm going to go through a few of the nuances that we can think about with this project today. And I'll talk about differences in size, where bees live, how they live, and what they eat, because that all does play a role in how we think about managing our landscapes in a way to support all of these different bee species. We'll start with size. I'm showing you two extremes. We have the smallest bee in the world on the left-hand side of your screen, Perdita minima, which is 0.08 inches in length. Then we have the largest bee in the world, Megachile Pluto, 2.5 inches in length. Many species could be anywhere between these two measurements. You can see how these bees would be playing different roles in the landscape because these sizes can be so different. Where bees live, there are 4 broad categories of places where bees will build their nests. Underground, females will burrow and build tunnels underneath the soil surface. Wood, that could be dead, sound, or rotting wood, depending on the species, but they will burrow through wood and build their nests there. Then we have stems and twig nesters. Maybe you can guess that is who we're focusing on today. They will use hollow stems, pithy stems, and twigs and build their nests inside of those stems and twigs. Then we have cavity nesters, where there's a large opening that they find and they then fill their nest into that cavity. I want to quickly point out that cavity nesters, best examples are honeybees and bumblebees. They're very charismatic. We probably know the most about those species comparable to other bee species, but that makes up less than 1% of all bee species worldwide. Alternatively, if we look at soil, 70% of all bee species live in the soil, and we know much less about those species. They're a little harder to study. So there's this discrepancy where very unique bees we know the most about, and the more common bees, you could say that we know less about. There's still so much we need to learn about bees. Within these nests, they can also live differently together. I'm talking about sociality here. Again, I'm showing you two extremes. There's a lot in the middle that we're skipping. But just for time, we'll talk about the two extremes. On one extreme, we have solitary species. This is where one individual female builds her own nest, lays her own eggs, collects her own food. She does everything on her own. She does not get any help from any other adult. Typically, these are on an annual life cycle. The adults only live for a few months, so they are laying their eggs, and then they do not make it through the winter, and then the next generation emerges, and those adults never interact with each other. On the other side, we have highly social species where there could be tens of thousands of individuals living together. They do work together. There's a division of labor, so not all of them are doing all of the tasks. Some are collecting food. Some are building the nest. Some are feeding the young. There's typically one reproductive in that whole colony. They do have overlapping generations. Adults are meeting the next generation of adults. And these nests are typically perennial, so they're lasting year after year. We have a discrepancy here where the highly used social species are pretty unique in the bee world, less than 5% of bee species worldwide. But our best example is honeybees. Again, we probably know the most about these species. We've studied them a lot. Solitary bees are more than 90% of all bee species worldwide, and we know much less about them. There's still a lot we need to learn about bees to make sure that we are protecting them the best way that we know how. Until we know those bees better, we may not know exactly how we need to protect them. So doing work like this is really important because we're learning new information still. And the last thing is what they eat. All bees need two things from flowers. They need pollen and nectar, but how they get that could be a little different. So again, a spectrum, I'm talking about two extremes. There's a lot in the middle we're skipping. But on one side, we have specialist pollinators. That is where a species needs a specific family, genus, or even species of flower, and they need to collect pollen from that specific kind of flower to successfully raise their young. Typically, this results in a very close relationship where the flower then also needs that specific bee to visit it to get the best pollination. On the other side, we have generalist pollinators, where if a flower produces pollen and nectar, because not all do, a generalist pollinator could very likely collect those resources, feed it to its young, and everything would be great. The caveat here is typically generalist pollinators then need many different kinds of flowers in the landscape. They're getting different nutrition from all of those different flower species to have the healthiest diet. That is just a quick overview of how different bee species can be from each other. Even though they are all bees, they can all provide pollination services. You can start to see all the nuances here. It's really important to consider bee diversity, all those differences in behavior, how they live, where they live, what they need to eat when we make land management decisions, because what we do for one species may be really beneficial. Maybe it does nothing to help another species. Maybe it's even actually harmful for another species. understanding those differences is really important so that we can make the best decision possible. When we're thinking about what bees are going to be in our gardens, when we're managing our gardens, maybe cutting back stems, who do we need to think about? We need to be thinking about stem nesters. Those are the ones that are building the nests in the plants that we're cutting back. How do we make sure we're protecting them? They're probably going to be solitary. They are building nests of maybe a dozen plus young. So there's going to be relatively small populations of these bees in the gardens. They're probably going to be generalists, and so they want to visit a wide variety of flowers. And they're going to be smaller bodied bees, right? They need to fit in these twigs and stems. I want to talk about the life cycle because this plays into how we think about managing these gardens. All bees go through this same general life cycle. They'll start as an egg. The adult female gives the egg a portion of pollen and nectar mixed together, and that is the food that the egg has for its whole life. It then develops into a larva and then into a pupa, and then it emerges fully grown as an adult. So if you see a small bee, it is fully grown. They don't grow after they emerge. Those adults will then mate. The females will then forage, build the next nest, and start this cycle over again. Depending on the species, this whole cycle could be as fast as 1 month, or it could take as long as a year to complete. When we're thinking about who's in our gardens, it's more likely on this longer end of the time period where this cycle is happening in the spring and summer. The foraging, the nesting, the egg laying, the larva development. A lot of species are pupa over the winter. So there will be baby bees in these gardens over the winter, and then they wait till the next spring to emerge as adults. I think that's important to keep in mind when we're thinking about these gardens. There are probably bees developing over the winter, and I'll show you some more details about that later. When we're thinking about this life cycle happening in a stem, this is a structure in case it's helpful for you to visualize. This is a plant stem. It used to have a flower head at the top that was broken off or cut off. The adult bee is going into this stem and building this linear nest where she's filling it from the back to the front. I think that's helpful to have in your mind when you picture who are we supporting in these gardens. Okay, so we'll get into the project now. We now know who we're expecting to be in these gardens. We know where they're nesting. And so we need to think about what this garden is providing for those bees over the year, and then when do we cut it back? There's going to be a vegetative stage of those plants. They're then going to flower. That's when pollinators and other insects are collecting resources from the flowers. They will then senesce and produce seeds. Maybe you leave those flower heads with the seeds for birds and other wildlife to eat. And then once everything is done, all of the resources have been utilized, everything's dormant for the winter. Maybe that's when you're thinking about cutting it back. But the question is when? When can we cut this back so that we're not removing bees and other beneficial insects out of our garden? To do this project, we worked with master gardener volunteers across the state. We worked in 10 counties. We worked with 9 extension agents, 18 master gardener volunteers. In total, they collected samples from 20 different gardens. I want to thank all of the volunteers and coordinators that helped make this possible. We could not have collected this number of samples from this many counties without them, so thank you. I want to thank the undergraduate students that helped process all the samples, and I definitely want to thank our working group, the NC State Extension Consumer and Youth Horticulture Working Group, because that is who funded this project and helped us develop and manage this project. So thank you, everyone. Here is what we ask the volunteers to do. Like I said, we'll start with a vegetative state in your garden. That is going to flower, and then the seed will be there. In the winter, everything should be dormant. But if we don't do anything to these stems, they may stay on the plant the next year, but there's also going to be brand new vegetation. We actually need to think about our gardens on a 2-year life cycle, right? A stem grows this first year and it's still going to be on the plant the next year, even if this cycle starts over again and there's new vegetation. So we're thinking about managing these old dried stems, not the new vegetative stems. We're focusing on the general time of year where people are thinking about managing their garden. And people have had recommendations at basically almost any time in this time period that's boxed here about when to cut back. We were testing when do we actually want to cut back between all of these options. In the first fall or winter, Our volunteers trimmed back all of the dried dead stems. The aim was to get about 100 stems in each garden. They trimmed them back to 18 to 24 inches. And then at each season, they collected a subsample for us. So after the first frost, but before the last frost, that's what we considered winter. And so volunteers collected about 20 to 30 of those trimmed stems. That was our winter sample. Then in the spring, about April to May, depending on the region, we had them collect another 20 to 30 samples, and that was our spring sample. Another 20 to 30 samples in summer, which was between July and August. Our last sample was in fall, which was just after the first frost. And so they collected samples at all of these time points out of that 100 pre-trimmed stems. They mailed them to us at NC State, labeled by flower type. We split them open in the lab to see, is there anything going on inside this stem? With the idea being at each time point, what was removed from the garden? That's basically what we were asking ourselves. If there was something in there, we identified the insect, or if it was a larva or a pupa, we tried to rear it out to adulthood so that we could identify it. In total, we received 68 bundles of stems. That totaled 2,356 stems. So lots of stems to process. When Elsa and I first started this project, we knew that stem nesting bees were out there. We can go out and we can see the adults. We know that they're nesting successfully in these gardens. But we had never actually been able to find a stem nest ourselves. They're very inconspicuous. You have to find them within all these stems. So we were a little worried we were looking for a needle in a haystack. But I'm very happy to report that we found active stem nests in these gardens, and we found many. So here's some of the stem nests that we found. Different species build different kinds. You can see some of the examples here. These are larvae that we're looking at from different kinds of insects. We also did find some stem nesting wasps. We also found adults in the stems. So we found all the life stages, egg, larva, pupa, and adults. These gardens were hosting insects and there was a lot of activity happening. So to summarize, even though we found 35 different active nests, out of over 2,000, that is only 1.5% of all stems had active nests in them. Not very many when you're thinking about it, but these were just random stems that our volunteers collected. So out of the whole landscape, we were still able to find stems. That just shows that these are occurring pretty widespread. And when we just take a very small sample, we were able to find them. If we're totaling, about 60% of our gardens had active nests that we detected across the study. So basically, this is happening everywhere, I would say, and it's just whether we detected it or not. Out of those stems, we found 12 different species of bees and wasps across 20 different kinds of plants. So there's a lot of activity happening. A lot of different species are utilizing these gardens, and they are using a lot of different kinds of plants. Of the different bees that we found, Serratina was the majority. That's this dark gray bee species. They accounted for 68% of all occupied stems. They were the most common. We also found leafcutter bees, which are Megachile and Hoplitus. We found yellowface bees, which are Hylaeus, and then we did find those stem nesting wasps that I mentioned. Because Serratina made up such a large proportion of our stems, I want to quickly tell you more about them. They're called the small carpenter bees. They are cousins to the larger carpenter bees that maybe you've had drilling holes in places you don't want them to drill holes, but these are stem nesters, so they would not use wood, they would use twigs and stems. They're very tiny, about the size of a large ant, and they use pithy and hollow stem. These are 2 Serratina nests that we found. They are going into the stems in your garden. They are the majority of the stem nesters that we found. So you may be asking, what plants did they use? What I'm showing you here is the insect type that I just showed you in that pie chart. And then here are the plant types that we had sent to us in this project. So I do want to highlight, we weren't testing for, is this a preferred plant for each of these insect types? We took whatever plant types people sent us. So this is just a summary. There could be other plants that these insects are using that we didn't get a sample from. The darker the color, the more often we found that insect nesting in that plant type. You can see Serratina was very often found in Echinacea, Solidago, Vernonia, and Salvia. We also took measurements of the stem size. Different sized insects may need different sized stems. That's also something you could consider if you're designing a pollinator garden. What plants do you want to put in based on what insects you really like? What size do those insects need? You can see the average diameter was 3/32 of an inch. We did find those stem nesting wasps. They are helpful neighbors to have in your garden. Stem nesting wasps are solitary, so they're not going to be protective like the social wasps are. They're actually going into the garden and hunting pesky things to eat and feed their young. So they can actually help with pest control. They needed larger stems. So that's an example of where thinking about what insects you want in your garden matches up with the plant species you're putting in your garden. You can see there's a smattering of other plant species that they used. Some very commonly used plants that we found across our studies: purple coneflower, Joe Pye weed, tall boneset, scarlet bee balm, New York ironwood, tall goldenrod, and rough goldenrod. This is not an exhaustive list. This is just what was sent to us and what we found stem nesting bees in. So this is more just a starting point, and I'm sure we can all find other plants that would be very helpful for these bees as well. At this point, I'll go into the summary of our findings and our updated recommendations. Allison, I can pause again in case there's questions.
Back to your earlier part of the talk, somebody asked if the older larvae are at the bottom of the stem, how do they get out past the younger ones?
Yes, it's a great question because you're exactly right. The oldest larva is at the end of the stem and it will develop quicker. Those older larvae, even though they're laid first, they do have somewhat of a delayed development. So they may be developing slower than the newer larvae. There's some hypotheses for why this is happening. Maybe they're getting less oxygen. Maybe there's just something going on that we don't know. So their timeline isn't too different than the other larvae. But we do know that in these stem nests, the oldest larva, if it's developed first and it's ready to go, it will just crawl over the other larva. They're all small bees. They're flexible. They can bend. I've seen them tumble around in these stems. They'll just crawl over.
I love that. Are the Ceratina commonly known as sweat bees, or what do we commonly call those?
The common name will be the small cardbinder bee.
If only 2% of the stems are occupied, and we removed 75% of our stems in the fall and left 25% for nesters to find, would that suffice?
Hard to say. In the next few slides, I'll show you some more nuance here. The difficult part is, yes, only 2% of the stems in our study were occupied. How do you know what 2% are being occupied? Depending on the timing of when you're trimming, that could mean you could still be removing stems, or you could be still providing enough resources. I have a chart that I'll show you and it'll make a little more sense. The difficult part is we don't know where and all of the stems they're nesting.
Along this line, if we cut stems and throw them on our compost pile intact, or make a pile of stems, does that work?
Yeah, that's a question I get a lot. If you want to make sure you're not damaging stems, you could cut all the way back to the ground, and then there's no possible stem nests for you to be damaging. But if the goal of you planting a garden is to support pollinators, a portion of the pollinator community that needs supporting is stem nesters. You're removing all of that habitat. There won't be anyone nesting in your garden. So you're not damaging any nests, but you're not providing any nesting habitat either. If you cut and remove, that is the same thing. You're still removing it from your garden. So you don't know if it's being used and it won't be there to be used over the winter. The other concern we have is that these stems stay pretty erect in your garden. Once we lay it on the ground, that is then susceptible to moisture buildup, mold buildup, fungal diseases, and pathogens. That's a really big issue for survival of these species. And if they're on the ground, they're going to be moist. It's much more likely that they'll get a fungal disease, and then the larvae in that nest could all die if they have a fungal disease. The other thing is they're then totally accessible for a predator to come right in the stem nest and eat the larva. These are pretty protein rich, so they're a good food source if something finds the larva. If they're erect, it's harder to find the nest and get in there. If it's down on the ground, anything crawling around on the ground could find it. So those are our two big concerns: moisture and predators once something's on the ground. You could say, well, I just won't trim my garden and then there won't be any stems that I am damaging. Similar thing to removing the entire stem. You're not damaging anything, but you're also maybe not providing nesting habitat. So it's up to you and what you want out of your garden. If you need to remove the stems, maybe you could try setting them in a well-draining pot so they're still vertical. It's draining, so it's not building up moisture, but that's hopefully a little more protection from predators and moisture. Okay, so we'll get into our findings. We told you we found stems, but when did we find them? The whole point was testing what season is best to cut back. Let's talk about that. I'm showing you on the bottom the seasons that we collected samples from: winter, spring, summer, and fall. I'll show you the graph of our data where on the y-axis is the probability of finding our active nests out of our whole data set during each of these seasons. In the first winter, these plants were just growing. This is the first time they're being trimmed. We did not find any nests in those first trimmed winter stems. But immediately in the spring, we found the majority of our active nests. And this is not entirely surprising. That's when we're seeing all of this activity at the flowers. So it makes sense that we're seeing a lot of activity as nests as well. 70% of our samples had at least one occupied stem during this time period. This was the prime nesting season. We also found a lot of nests in summer, 55%, but less than spring. In the fall, we also found nests active in the fall, going into the next winter. What this is telling us is that it is only safe if you want to make sure that you are protecting these stem nesting bees. The only time we found 0 nests was the very first winter that stem was on the plant. After that time period, you could have a nest at any other season. So if you're trimming your garden, it's a possibility that you're cutting through a bee nest or you're cutting a stem and removing a bee nest out of your garden. The other thing we looked at in this first winter was that was the first time we trimmed. One of the volunteers were trimming and they were sending us trimmed stems and we were missing something in the trimmings. So the second year we did this, we had them send us the trimmings and still we did not find any nests. So we feel pretty confident telling you that you can safely cut back in your first winter. We would say anything we found online does not match with our results. So we are telling you we have completely new, completely updated recommendations. Our recommendations are that we need to think about our stems on this 2-year cycle, first of all. So you have the first year where it's growing, and then that nest stem is going to stay on the plant for year 2. You can see in the background, there's more stems that go through the same cycle. They'll be a year delayed. So we're not talking about the new growth in year 2. We're still focusing on this dried stem from year 1. We need to think about this stem on a 2-year cycle now. So when you're trimming is end of year 1, that's the time where it's safe to trim. At the very end of year 1, because these were just intact flower heads, the bees did not have access to building nests in these stems. Once you trim them, once they're broken, once you go in and cut them, at any point the next year, there could be stems. Once the bees have access to it, at any point in the year, there could be stems. We now know that during the early part of the year, that's going to be more eggs and larvae. End of the year, it could be larva pupa. Depending on the species, there could also be adults there. What our volunteers were reporting to us is that by the end of year 2, the fall and winter, they were actually having difficulty sending us 20 to 30 stems. These stems are naturally breaking down in the second year. Unless it's a very woody plant, they're not going to be in your garden forever. As long as you're okay having some of this aesthetics for the winter months, they will start breaking down. And then the bees will use next year's stems that you cut, and then those will break down. But it's a continuous cycle over and over again. You could not trim in the first winter, leave those flower heads, and the bees will not have access to the stems. The stems need to be broken or cut for something to go inside the stem. You could not trim, and then there wouldn't be any nests. You aren't damaging anything, but you're also not providing habitat. If you cut down to the bottom again in this first winter, you can feel pretty comfortable that you're not removing anything as long as these flower heads are intact. That prevents anything from getting in the stem. But again, you're not providing any habitat. If your goal is to provide habitat in your pollinator garden, bees need food and they need nesting sites. If your goal is to support bees, we are recommending that you trim in this first winter only. and then you do not touch that stem again. Every year you'll have new stems to cut, but you're never recutting an old stem. In this project, we cut them back 18 to 24 inches. I think that as long as you're around a foot, that's probably good. If you want to leave it longer, that's also very helpful. Shorter than that, we can start to have issues with moisture and predators again. Think about your garden and what makes sense. We understand people want a neat and tidy garden, or maybe your neighbors want you to have a neat and tidy garden. So we do need to manage these gardens to make everyone happy. The way that we found provides the nesting habitat for bees without damaging them is only cutting once in the first winter and then just letting that stem naturally degrade over time. We do have several resources that you can use, and we can share these links later. We did make a formal fact sheet through NC State Extension that goes through these details. We also have a more quick read extension post that describes that. We did make a video where we explain with visuals how we recommend trimming back. All three of these are talking about this project, just maybe presenting it in a different way, and you can see what works best for you. That is our findings, and those are our updated recommendations. I'm happy to take any other questions that popped up.
One of the questions is, how do we go about changing our existing garden management practices to be more bee-friendly? New garden management recommendations. And I think you've just shown us how that's going to shift things, especially if our goal is to really provide nesting habitat and supporting the bees in our gardens. We're going to have to change or clean up. When you talk about removing flowers, we're talking about deadheading only and letting the old stems degrade, not coming in at some point and cutting those, but just letting that natural degradation happens. The work that you guys have done is fabulous.
That's really nice to hear. I do want to highlight again that the time period we're recommending is sometime after first frost, but before last frost. After that time period, the bees are going to be active again. So we want the nests to be available to them as soon as they're ready in the spring. If you're doing it in between the frosts, we know that they're not active at the time when you're managing it. So this is perfect timing. You're probably thinking about doing this relatively soon from now. It is a slight change to probably what most of you are doing. We didn't know what was happening in these stems before this project. So now that we know that, we can match it up with the biology. Hopefully that all makes sense for why we're changing these recommendations.
Somebody made a comment earlier about creating dead hedges. How do we do this and also have neighbors? I think this is part of our education as gardeners, not only for ourselves, but helping people around us understand why we're just not being lazy. We're actually supporting our native bee populations by doing what we're doing.
Exactly. Great point. I do think that if people aren't gardening themselves, or maybe they're gardening, but they're not in this world, right? They're not getting this educational material. Another aspect similar to this is leave the leaves. We can also say save the stems. There's lots of other habitat that the garden provides beyond stems. I understand that to be a good neighbor, we do want to keep things neat and tidy. Maybe there's some way you can arrange your garden or design your garden so that visually it makes sense. There's borders. People seem to like borders. I think it's an opportunity to be creative and have fun with how you make this work. But I agree with you, Allison. There's some education as well.
Just put up a pollinator habitat sign and you can get away with anything.
Those are helpful.
Are native plants preferable over other plants? What do you say about that?
This is a big question right now. So I'll give you the whole thought process through it. There's a difference between an exotic plant and an invasive plant. Even natives can be invasive. It's a characteristic where it takes over the ecosystem. It outcompetes other plants. We don't necessarily want any sort of invasive plant, whether it's native or exotic, especially exotics, I would say. There are some well-behaved plants that maybe aren't native here. And there are reasons why you would or would not use those. When we're thinking about a pollinator garden, the things that we're thinking about providing to bees is pollen and nectar. And now we can also think about providing stem nesting habitat. So if a plant is providing those three things and our goal is supporting pollinators, then that plant is supporting your goal. There's some research where even if it's a native species, the region it's grown in can change how that interacts in your landscape. Sourcing your seeds locally helps the plant success in general. There's evidence of that, and it can help with the nutrition of the pollen and nectar that you're getting native cultivars as well. A lot of that is going to be up to each person, but if you're trying to support pollinators, if a plant is providing pollen and nectar and then stem nesting habitat, that plant is helping you achieve your goal.
What about the cute little bee houses? Do those work for nesters?
There's some research coming out of NC State. Elsa Youngstead's a part of it as well, where they are putting up bee hotels around campus and monitoring them. Some bee hotels, depending on the location, are more popular than others. So some are going to be probably close to what we found with this project, a pretty low percentage of occupancy, and some are just more popular. The issue with those bee hotels that you need to keep in mind is that that's not a very natural setup. We're condensing a lot of stems very close together. So there is some more maintenance that needs to be done with that. And there is a document through NC State Extension, Managing Bee Hotels, I believe is the title. Elsa Youngstead is one of the co-authors. So if you Google that, you'll find it. And it's a free PDF. There is some maintenance involved. Because it's so tightly packed, we have the same concerns that we talked about with putting stems on the ground. Pathogens can build up really quickly because things are moving between nests, and predators and parasites can move up very quickly because they can just hop from nest to nest. So if you want to do that, that document has guidance for how to make a successful bee hotel.
If it's vertical, it's harder for predators to get in, but if it's horizontal, you might have predators enter more easily.
That's our hypothesis right now.
Okay.
That's our concern. When it's in the bee hotel, there is that horizontal component. Most of the time, the way the bee hotels are set up, it's hopefully protecting from rain, and so you shouldn't see the moisture. But with the predators there, it's just that the entrance to each stem is right next to each other, and so they can just hop around.
I'm assuming in your handout material, there's probably a list of plants that have hollow stems that are good for nesting. There's a question about sumac. It's got a hollow stem. Do you know if that's a good nesting plant?
It's a good question. I don't believe we got any sumac in this project. In the fact sheet, we have a whole chart that goes through what we collected. We go through a little bit of the literature. So other people that have published, they found a nest in that plant. We have a little bit of that information in that chart. So the fact sheet will go into more depth about what we found. The bee hotel document I was just talking about goes through some plant types as well, particularly thinking about different diameter sizes. The bee hotel guide will have more information about that.
I love it. I think we're going to look at plants a lot differently and be more curious about their stems. Maybe this is a good review. In the fall, after the first frost, we come in and remove the flowers to expose the hollow stem. And you're talking about leaving those stems and
Yes.
letting them degrade naturally. We're not going to come in the spring or any other time that following year and cut them back.
Correct. Once you trim once, you don't go back and trim again. For example, I have blackberry bushes. Those are woody. They're not going to degrade. We find Serratina in blackberry bushes. If anyone has that, it's a great stem nesting resource. Let's say you have those bushes for 10 years, you're cutting back stems every year. Those dead stems are going to build up in numbers. So there is some level where if you really must remove them, you could try putting them in the pot like we talked about. But if you're talking about stem that's going to degrade over time, it's not as woody. Our volunteers were telling us that by the end of the second year, they already were not finding enough stems. So we expect them to degrade very shortly. So trim
Pretty
it
quick.
once and then don't trim it again.
But if you do trim it, you want to go 18 to 24 inches.
That's what we did for this study. We're not saying that that's the only height. We're not even saying that's the best height. Based on what we saw in the literature, that was our best guess. And we did find stems, so we know that that height worked. But we can't tell you that that is the best height ever to use. We just know it worked for us very well, and that's what we're recommending. So after the first frost, before the last frost, go in and trim back. Basically
Okay.
deadhead, just deadhead a little extra to get the stem
Okay.
height.
I think this is just going to be one of those learning by doing kind of things. I'm just so grateful for your time and for your work with Elsa. Will you guys continue working in this, looking at stems?
Our next project we're looking at is actually ground nesting bees, because that's another nesting type we don't know a lot about. Perhaps after that project, if there's a lot of questions that people still have when they implement these new recommendations, we could do some targeted questions to update it. But this next year, we're trying to learn more about ground nesting bees.
I want to thank you so much, Dr. Levenson, for joining us today.